Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees.
Episode 104, Ford versus Ford. Edward and Grace Ford featured in a series of newspaper articles in 1895, one article titled The Ford versus Ford Scandal. Grace Ford was born Grace Jenkins in Bendigo in 1859, and she was the daughter of John Jenkins and Mary Ann Sainsbury, who'd immigrated from England in January 1853. John was a cooper prior to immigration and continued this trade in Golden Square, Bendigo. John and Mary Ann had 7 children. John was featured twice in articles in Bendigo, the first on the 30th of September 1856, under the Court of Petty Sessions for drunken disorderly, and it names him as being very drunk but not very disorderly and fined 20 shillings. And then on the 5th of December 1871 in the Bendigo Advertiser, his death is outlined with an article titled A Dreadful Fate. As a late hour on Sunday night, a man named John Jenkins met with a horrible death in his hut at Ironstone Hill, Epsom. He'd been staying at a shanty near his place of abode all Sunday and remained there until 11 o'clock at night, during which time he had drunk a considerable quantity of stimulants. On his departure with a man named Edward Bradbury, he was not sober but managed to walk home, where he parted company with Bradbury, who also went home. He had not been there minutes before he saw a reflection of light, and on going out he saw Jenkins' place was in flames. He, Daniel Stokes and George Matterhead ran to the hut. The fire was rapidly spreading and breaking out in every part of the building. The door was bolted inside and it was burst open as quick as thought, but immediately as this was done the flames rushed out and access was impossible. The chimney was then pulled down and a ghastly spectacle was revealed. The body of Jenkins was being devoured by a raging fire, and as the flames spread and the flesh was being burnt from the bones, it was a sight sickening to behold. Nothing could be done, and the body had to remain there until the fire had subsided. In the morning, information was given to the police, and yesterday an inquest was held at the Shamrock Hotel, Epsom. The evidence showed that the deceased was a man of intemperate habits, and it was supposed that when he went to his hut, in lighting a lamp he accidentally set fire to the habitation, and before he could escape he was surrounded by the flames and thus consumed. The jury returned a verdict of accidental death. So it's sounding by the way that article is outlined that John Jenkins was no longer living with the family, and Grace was only 13 when her father died. Her mother, Mary Ann Jenkins, she passed away at nearly 100 years old, and the article outlining this says almost a centenarian. There died at the residence of her daughter, Mrs. Olds of Booth Street, Golden Square, on Friday evening last, one of Bendigo's oldest residents in the person of Mrs. Mary Ann Jenkins at the ripe old age of 99 years and 5 months. The deceased lady was a citizen of Bendigo for 66 years and was one of the founders of the Golden Square Methodist Church. She was for 40 years an ardent and successful Sunday school teacher, a great worker in the mothers' meetings, which were then a potent section of the work of the church, and later in life as a nurse, where she was well known for her great kindness of heart and helpness to all those that were in need. Grace Ford married George Tumner Willingale on the 10th of January 1881 in Melbourne. George was born in England in 1847 and arrived in Sydney in 1865. He had been married to Elizabeth Johnson in Sydney in March 1867, and the notice of their wedding says by Reverend Dr. Badley of the Free Church of England, Brisbane Street, Mr. George Tumner Willingale of 2 Goulburn Street, to Elizabeth, daughter of Mr. William Johnson of 3 Goulburn Street. George and Elizabeth had 2 children prior to their marriage, Sarah in March 1864 in Brisbane, and another child in August 1865 in Sydney, who did not survive infancy. Elizabeth Johnson returned to England early in 1869 with their daughter Sarah. Elizabeth also gave birth to their 3rd child in March 1869 on the ship La Hogue on the voyage from Brisbane to England. It doesn't seem to have divorced Elizabeth. Elizabeth didn't die in England until 1883. However, George then went on to marry Grace Jenkins in January 1881. George was 11 years older than Grace, and the marriage in the paper states on the 10th of January by special licence at St Peter's by Reverend H. Handfield, George T. Willingale of Pimlico, London, to Grace, fourth daughter of the late John Jenkins of Sandhurst. George listed his occupation as a painter from Sydney, and Grace living in Fitzroy at the time of their marriage. They had a daughter, Florence Louise Willingale, who was born in Victoria in 1882. Florence married John Archibald Doby Brown in Victoria in 1917. Florence died in Heidelberg, Victoria in 1951 at the age of 69. George Willingale died only 3 years after he married Grace on the 3rd of August 1884 at the age of only 39. Grace then went on to marry Edward Ford in 1887 in Victoria. Edward Ford was born in Dunchurch, England on the 2nd of November 1845 and was 14 years older than Grace. He arrived on the Wanada with his parents and 3 older brothers to Melbourne on the 4th of October 1852. Edward Ford firstly married Elizabeth McGill in Melbourne on the 8th of October 1874. She actually revised her name to Elizabeth Purdy on the marriage certificate, and this was because she had already been married prior. Elizabeth was Irish, and she was born in 1833 and was 12 years younger than Edward, and she had a child with Joseph Purdy when she was 18, a child named Jane Eleanor Purdy in 1851. When Elizabeth and Joseph Purdy's daughter Jane married in 1869 in Victoria, Joseph Purdy listed himself as a wine merchant from Newry, Ireland. Elizabeth then went on to marry John Overend in Victoria in 1854 under the name Elizabeth Purdy. Elizabeth and John Overend had a son, John, who was born in November 1856, who died at the age of 16 months in February 1857, a daughter Elizabeth in Collingwood in 1859, who died at 10 months old, and a son, Robert Stanton Overend, in Melbourne in 1860. So before she married Edward Ford, she'd actually had 2 marriages and 4 children. John Overend was a publican. In 1854, he owned the Prince Albert Hotel at Collingwood. In 1857, he was the publican of the Royal Oak in Swanston Street. And in September 1857, he sold the Royal Oak in Swanston Street, and later they were at Williamstown, and John was the landlord of the Rainbow Hotel. So Elizabeth McGill and Edward Ford had one child, a son, Edward James Ford, in Echuca on the 9th of June 1876. Edward moved to Perth in 1897 and married Violet Simpson in November 1899. Edward James Ford, he was secretary at Parliament House and lived at Parliament House. And on the 19th of November 1949, Edward James Ford was listed in the Daily News in Perth. Golden wedding of ex-sports star. Former state bowling champion Edward James Ford and his wife will celebrate half a century of married life on Sunday. 4 generations of the family will attend their golden wedding party to be held at their Bassendean home. Mr Ford, whose son is Western Australia tennis and badminton star Ron Ford, was well known in parliamentary circles. At 21, he travelled here from Victoria. He first worked at Coolgardie, then with the Railway Department, before taking on the job of Secretary of the Joint House Committee and Controller of the Parliamentary Refreshment Rooms. He held this position for 31 years before retiring in 1946. Mr Ford played tennis when a young man before turning to bowls. He was a 5-time singles bowls champion for Western Australia. He was twice pairs champion and twice in teams, which won the state 4 championships. So getting back to Edward Ford, in December 1874, he applied for a publican's licence. I, Edward Ford of Echuca, hereby give notice at the next licensing meeting to apply for a publican's licence for a house situated at High Street, Echuca, known as the Echuca Hotel, containing 20 rooms. By May 1875, he's put in another application for a licence at a house situated at the corner of Hare and Percy Streets, Echuca, containing 6 rooms. This was known to be the Union Club Hotel. On the 7th of April 1884, tenders were invited for pulling down the Union Club Hotel in Echuca and erecting a new hotel premises for Edward Ford Esquire. and by December 1884 there was a preliminary notice for an auction for a valuable hotel property. Mr. James Shackle has received instructions from Edward Ford Esquire, who's about to visit Europe, to sell by public auction at the end of January the Union Club Hotel. There was an auction sale attached to this in February 1885. On Thursday, Messrs. Shackle and Sons will conduct a public auction for Mr. Ford's Union Club Hotel at the corner of Hare and Percy Streets. The famous hostelry is admitted by all who are competent to judge to be the best paying hotel in Echuca, and we're authorised that the only reason Mr. Ford is selling the property is in consequence of death of the family, which necessitates his need to go back to the old country. Now, as far as I can ascertain, this sale didn't go ahead, and the reason for this is that in the next year, in June 1886, it was announced Elizabeth's death. On the 10th of June at the Union Club Hotel Echuca, the beloved wife of Edward Ford and mother of Mr. R.S. Overend and Mrs. T. Trude, both of Sale, aged 53 years. The article in the Echuca paper outlining Elizabeth's death says, Mrs. Ford, wife of Mr. Edward Ford of the Union Club Hotel, died at 1:30 yesterday morning after several weeks of suffering. The deceased lady, who has resided in Echuca for about 12 years, had the cause of death of dropsy and a general break-up of the system. For many months past, Mrs. Ford has complained of ill health, and about 12 months ago she visited Melbourne and Sale for the benefit of her health and returned to Echuca much benefited, but after a short respite her health again failed and she was confined to her bed, where she received the careful attention of Dr. Osborne, but all the medical skill was of no avail, and her case was considered a hopeless one a month or two ago, her death being hourly expected. At times she was at death's door, and then a change came for the better, but unfortunately the changes were only of short duration, and eventually dropsy supervened, and she passed peacefully away. The funeral of the deceased will take place this afternoon, the cortege leaving the Union Club Hotel for the Echuca Cemetery. A few months later, in November 1886, Edward Ford applies for a victualler's licence at Hare Street, Echuca, saying he was applying for a victualler's licence for the premises situated at Hare Street, Echuca, known as a Union Club Hotel, of 14 rooms. On the 19th of February 1887, the marriage is announced of Grace and Edward Ford Willingale. On the 15th of February at Trinity Church, Williamstown, by Reverend T.W. Sargent, Edward Ford, hotel keeper of Echuca, to the widow of G.T. Willingale, late of Sydney. So on the 16th of May 1888, mentions hotel changes. We learn that the Union Club Hotel, which has been so long owned and occupied by Edward Ford, is about to be vacated by him and let to Mr. J. O'Brien. We understand it is Mr. Ford's intention to leave the district. Mr. Ford's been a resident of Echuca for 17 years and has always taken an active interest in sporting matters. In the earlier days, he was more actively connected with athletic sports and has of late years acted as a handicapper in conjunction with other local athletes, for which his intimate knowledge of the sport and runners eminently fitted him. Mr. Ford was also a strong supporter of cricket and has taken more than an ordinary interest in racing. His many friends will doubtlessly regret to hear that he's resolved to leave a place in which he has been so intimately associated for so many years. And in January 1938, there was a reminiscence of the Union Club Hotel and its early history. And it states that the disposal of the Union Club Hotel to the Bank of Australasia has been tentatively arranged, and it recalls the fact that the hotel building has occupied a prominent place in the civic and social activities of Echuca for over half a century. It was erected in 1875 by a man named Edward Ford and was well and faithfully constructed, bearing testimony to the splendid workmanship of the artisans of those days. Ford was a man of progressive ideas, and among other things he attempted to do was to promote a sports gathering on an area in Warren Street known as Len's Orchard, which was in a recreational reserve. But before a meeting could be held, the flood came down the Murray and Campaspe rivers and the area was rendered unfit. So within 12 months of the announcement that Edward was leaving town, a deed of separation was lodged between Grace and Edward Ford. And in December 1889, Edward Ford has his properties for sale. Unreserved sale of valuable township properties. Shackle White and Company Limited, favoured with instructions from Edward Ford Esquire, will sell by auction at their yards in Warren Street the following desirable properties. Lot 1, the paddock known as Ford's Recreation Ground, 18 acres. This splendid block of land is especially adapted for a sports ground or a vineyard, orchard, poultry or pig farm. The water is laid to within a chain of the fence at both ends. The fence, which is most substantial, cost Mr. Ford £435. Grubbing and clearing cost £100, and the soil was top-dressed with about 2,000 loads of stable manure and 1,800 loads of garden loam, so that the land must contain all the elements of fertility. Lot 2, at Crossonvale, area of 1 acre. The land is in Bridge Street, in close vicinity to Captain Page's property. Mr. Ford has resolved to sell absolutely to the highest bidder. 4 years after the announcement of him leaving Echuca and the sale of his properties, an article is titled "A Maintenance Case." At the Prahran Police Court yesterday, Grace Ford sued her husband, Edward Ford, formerly a hotel keeper of this town, for maintenance. The complainant in her evidence stated that she and her husband had kept a hotel in Echuca. After being laid up with diphtheria, she went to Sydney for a change. When she returned, the defendant ill-treated her and turned her out of the house. Under a deed of separation, he agreed to give her £1 a week, but has not paid anything for the past 5 or 6 weeks. He was a retired gentleman and did nothing but walk about. The bench made an order for the payment of £1 per week. 3 weeks later, in the county court today, Grace Ford brought an action against her husband, Edward Ford Butcher, for the recovery of £18 damages for breach of contract, assault and money due. The husband alleges that his wife, who is living apart from him, has been guilty of misconduct. The case is proceeding. Both parties are well known in Echuca. So in the Riverine Herald of Echuca, on the 13th of February 1895, it outlines details of the case. Ex-Echuca residents in court. Action by a wife against her husband in Melbourne. Today in the County Court, the action brought by Grace Ford against her husband, Edward Ford Butcher of Fitzroy, in which plaintiff claimed £18 damages, £10 of which was for breach of contract to live apart, £5 for alleged assault and £3 for money due. Mrs. Ford stated in her evidence that she used to keep the Union Club Hotel Echuca 7 years ago and remained there for 2 years. Her husband and she agreed to live apart by a deed of separation drawn up in 1889. Recently, he had been constantly molesting her. He had followed her about from place to place, and on the 17th of December, he threatened he would kill her before he had done with her. For the defence, there was an absolute denial of the charges. On the 17th of December, he found his wife in what he considered bad company. He denied that he said he would kill her. A man named Leeson, who passed himself off as Johnson, an engineer, was with his wife on the night of the 17th of December. In cross-examination, Ford stated he had to publicly apologise to a resident of Echuca of high position whom he had falsely accused of committing adultery with his wife. The case had not concluded when the court rose. In the Bendigo Independent on the 13th of February, the Ford versus Ford scandal, Melbourne. Some more of the dirty linen which has accumulated in the Ford household since the separation of husband and wife was publicly washed in the county court today. Grace Ford, the wife, sued her husband for £18 for arrears under a deed of separation for breach of contract and assault. When the parties separated, the husband contracted not to molest or interfere with his wife. It's now alleged that he's broken the contract by following her about and annoying her. The defendant pleads the misconduct of his wife with different men. Mrs. Ford, in re-examination by Herbert Barrett, said she kept a hotel at Echuca for 2 years. She knew a number of people at Echuca and occasionally visited Bendigo, where her mother, brother and sister resided. Mr. Thompson called on her to see if she could give him information about a Mr. Button, a customer at the Cafe Continental. She was at the time engaged at the cafe as a waitress. She had another time lived with a Mrs. Tanner and left her of her own free will. Mr. Braun, whom she had known for 14 or 15 years, was a wine merchant at Bendigo. Jessie Parker, a music teacher and friend of the plaintiff, gave evidence in support of Mrs. Ford's case, admitting writing a letter to the judge and apologised for so doing. Edward Ford, the defendant, said on the 17th of December he saw Mrs. Parker and his wife leaning on the arms of Mrs. Horsburgh and Johnson, respectively. Johnson came out and returned with packages which looked like fish and beer bottles. Mrs. Ford was sitting down close by Johnson on a box, and there were on the table several empty bottles. He said it was nice company for his wife to keep for 2 hours, and she called him a liar, saying she'd only been there for a few minutes. After they left, Johnson accompanied Mrs. Ford to her own place. He followed his wife and Mr. Braun to Windsor at 20 minutes to 12 at night and then lost them. He had seen his wife go into an oyster shop with a man and into a hotel with one. Sarah Tanner said she first met Mrs. Ford in 1892 during a return voyage from England. She went under the name of Mrs. Steele and told the witness she went to England with a Mr. Shaw. Mrs. Ford lived with her at St Kilda and was visited by a great many gentlemen. Braun was one of them, and he passed under the name of Wilson. The hearing will be resumed tomorrow. So on the 14th of February 1895, husband and wife, the Ford case, Melbourne. The case of Grace Ford against her husband, Edward Ford, was continued in the county court today. Mrs. Tanner was cross-examined by Herbert Barrett, and she said that she did not know what the expression house of ill fame meant and did not read all the things that were in the papers. She admitted that Mrs. Ford had been using her home for immoral purposes, but said she could not turn her out as she refused to go. Detective Sergeant Nixon deposed to seeing Mrs. Ford at late hours in the company with men. The case had not concluded when the court adjourned. In the Bendigo Independent on the 14th, the Ford scandal. Mrs. Tanner, a witness for Mr. Ford, stated that she was in receipt of money. She was an independent woman. She reasserted what she'd stated before as to having seen Mrs. Ford at her house in company with a man under circumstances of great suspicion. Mrs. Ford was a bad-tempered woman and had assaulted her on 1 or 2 occasions. Constable Gorin of Echuca stated he'd met Mrs. Ford at the All Nations Hotel in Echuca. She accepted an invitation to join him in a drink. She said she was with a nice young man with plenty of money and that she'd been all over the continent and had enjoyed herself. Sergeant Nixon said he'd seen Mrs. Ford about town at night and he'd seen her visit a coffee palace in company with Mr. Braun. Her conduct was apparently that of a dissolute woman. David Horsburgh gave evidence about the visit of Mrs. Ford and Mrs. Parker to his place. He said they had 6 bottles of beer and some fish. Mrs. Ford sang and he joined in the chorus. Thomas Leeson, or Johnson, one of the aforesaid jovial parties, said Mrs. Ford and himself were skylarking on the sofa. In reply to Mr. Barrett, he said it was he who suggested the trapping of the woman. He went under a false name because he did not want to be known by his correct name. The hearing was not concluded when the court adjourned. In the Bendigo Advertiser on the 19th of February 1895, the Ford matrimonial case, interesting evidence. The Ford case occupied the attention of Judge Chomley in the county court again today. The plaintiff, Grace Ford, claims £18 from her husband for breach of contract, dated the 23rd of February 1889, under which they were to live apart if unmarried, the defendant agreeing not to interfere with her. The defence was that the plaintiff had been guilty of misconduct. The case for the defendant closed on Thursday with an adjournment which was granted to allow the rebutting of evidence being called for by the plaintiff. The first witness examined today was Albert Braun, who resides at Bendigo. He stated he was a wine traveller and formerly a vigneron. He had known Mrs. Ford and her family for many years and had seen her frequently at Echuca in Melbourne. He emphatically denied that improper relations had existed between Mrs. Ford and himself, nor did he ever go into or stay at a coffee palace with Mrs. Ford. He had met her at Mrs. Tanner's house on 2 occasions. On the first occasion, he had a message to deliver on behalf of some friends from Bendigo, and on the other occasion, he simply called in to see her in an ordinary way. He ceased to have the vineyard in January 1892. He was then in a good financial position, but during 1893 lost considerably through backing other people's bills. He was a married man. He'd taken Mrs. Ford to the theatre and the cyclorama and remembered taking her home by train to Windsor. He also took her home by tram. He had oysters with her once. He never went under the name of Wilson, but had letters sent to him in that name. There was a pre-arrangement between the witness and a Mr. Wilson of Ballarat that the witness was to receive letters from him in that name. Witness admitted having received letters from Mrs. Ford addressed Wilson, Post Office, Bendigo. The correspondence ceased years ago, but on being pressed, he admitted that he might have received 2 or 3 letters during the past 12 months. He believed he took the plaintiff to Sorrento and the Back Beach and back home in one day. She also accompanied him to St Kilda, where he had business to do. His reason for having his letters addressed under the name of Wilson was that he did not want any of the letters to fall into his family's hands. He had known Mrs. Ford as Willingdale before she was married. Several plainclothes constables gave evidence to the effect that they knew nearly all of the women of ill repute, but they'd never seen Mrs. Ford about the city. The rebutting case having closed, Mr. Eagleson addressed the court for the defence. He contended that the defendant had in no way broken the contract by interfering with the plaintiff. He contended that the plaintiff's behaviour showed that she was undoubtedly of extremely low moral sensibilities. He held that she had not been chaste, as demanded by the agreement of the separation. Mr. Barrett asked whether it was necessary for a woman, because she and her husband had agreed to live apart, to give up all her friends. He contended there had been a deliberate trap laid to try and catch Mrs. Ford. His Honour reserved his decision and the court adjourned till tomorrow. And in the Melbourne Leader on the 23rd of February 1895, the Ford matrimonial case. Judge Chomley in the County Court on Tuesday delivered his reserved judgment in the case of Ford versus Ford. His Honour said the parties had been separated by a deed in February 1889. This contained a clause that the husband should provide for his wife as long as she remained chaste and that he should not molest her. The plaintiff alleged that the husband had broken the agreement by molesting her, inasmuch as he had followed her about the street on several occasions when he saw her in company with other men. He had a perfect right to do this under the deed because his liability to pay her maintenance ceased on proof of her unchastity. If the circumstances led the husband to believe that she was behaving improperly, he was entitled to observe her conduct. On the 17th of December, however, he rushed into a private house and interfered with her, and this was an act of molestation, but the circumstances connected with this did away with any claim for damages. As to the alleged assault on that occasion, there was the evidence of 2 women in support and of 4 men against it. His Honour did not think that an assault has been committed. As to the claim for the arrears, the defendant alleged that his liability was banished by his wife's unchastity, and he stated that she had been guilty of adultery with Albert Braun at Mrs. Tanner's home. On this, there was no evidence. Then he charged her with misconduct with a man named Thompson at Mrs. Tanner's residence, and this rested solely on the evidence of Mrs. Tanner, which in many respects was so unsatisfactory that His Honour could not place entire reliance upon it. He therefore held the charge not proved. It was further alleged that the plaintiff had been guilty of misconduct with a man named Spearing of Echuca, of which there is no evidence. There were other charges in regards to her connection with a man named Shaw and also Braun, and that he held that there was evidence of adultery in each of these cases. She had, after a few minutes' conversation with a constable, described to him a trip to England with a man who she said had plenty of money. What did that mean except that she travelled with a man as his mistress? All that she had said might have been mere boast, but what class of woman would boast such a transaction? Certainly not a decent woman or one who wished to be thought of as one. It was the boast of a brazen woman who wished to be recognised as such. Detective Sergeant Nixon stated that he had seen her loitering about and that she was from all appearances a prostitute, and His Honour thought, with every respect for the evidence of the plainclothes constables, who said that they had never seen her before, that they did not contradict Nixon's evidence that she wandered about in an aimless way. It appeared from this that she went about the street, from one oyster shop to another and from one bar to another. There was also the admission of plaintiff that Shaw took her to Brighton to obtain accommodation in a hotel, though she knew the people of the house perfectly well. His Honour thought that the charge in relation to Shaw was established. In regard to Braun, who denied all charges of improprieties, it had been dragged out of him in cross-examination that he had taken the plaintiff to places of amusement on more than one occasion and that he had taken her to Sorrento. He also admitted that he corresponded with her in a false name. The evidence which has been adduced in regard to this man could leave no doubt as to what the relations between them were, and he considered the charge proved. Technically, plaintiff had established the charge of molestation, but she had brought it upon herself by her own conduct, and he would consequently award her 1 shilling's damages without costs on that issue. On the issues of assault and arrears of maintenance, he would fine for the defendant with costs against the plaintiff. So effectively, Grace Ford lost her case. After all of the publicity around this, Grace went very quiet, and the next time there was any evidence of Grace was on the 15th of October 1926, when an article stated in the Herald in Melbourne that a nurse's skull was fractured. And it says, Mrs. Grace Willingdale, interesting, she's gone back to her previous married name, 56, nurse of Powell Street, South Yarra, was knocked down by a cable tram at the corner of Collins and Swanston Streets this morning. She was admitted to Melbourne Hospital with a fractured skull. Her condition is extremely grave. Grace Ford died in the Kew Asylum of heart disease on the 22nd of November 1951. She also went under the name of Wilhelmina Willingale, and in the law notices on the 23rd of November was the estate of Grace Ford, but it also says formerly Grace Willingale and commonly known as Grace Willingale, late of 10 Powell Street, South Yarra, widow, deceased, and her probate was granted by the Supreme Court of Victoria on the 12th of November. And the probate was awarded to Leslie Hurry Wells of 48 Powell Street, South Yarra Blacksmith, the executor, and Norman McLeod McFerrian of 39 Davis Street, South Yarra Leather Merchant. And the substituted executor named and appointed by the deceased will was Florence Louise Brown of 10 Powell Street, South Yarra, married woman. So Florence is the daughter that she had with George Willingale, and so it seems that Grace lived with her daughter and her son-in-law before she was admitted into the Kew Asylum. And Edward Ford, well, he must have moved over to Western Australia at some stage to be closer to his son, as there was a record in the Western Australian Perth newspaper on the 10th of February 1926 stating, "The friends of Mr. Edward James Ford of Parliament House, Perth, are respectfully informed that the remains of his late dearly beloved father Edward will be privately interred at the Church of Christ portion of the Karrakatta Cemetery." So very much twists and turns happening between Edward Ford and Grace Ford, and it certainly didn't end up to be a happy marriage, unfortunately, for them.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.